good morning, good afternoon. I'm Christine Champion, and Frédéric and I are very pleased to welcome you today to this EDHEC Infra Natixis webinar, which will present the first publication from the EDHEC Infra Research Chair on ESG and infrastructure investments. Today's webinar gathers a various audience, and we are very pleased with the interest raised. And I'll take this opportunity to share a reminder on the history between Natixis and EDHEC Infra. Natixis is a French multinational financial services firm specialized in asset wealth management, corporate investment banking, insurance and payments, with nearly 60,000 employees across 38 countries, and is a subsidiary of Group BPCE, which is the second largest banking group in France. Natixis has a long-standing presence in infrastructure finance, and we are recognized as recognized players and a leader in advising and financing infrastructure across the world. And that's the reason why in 2012 we decided to endow a research chair with EDHEC Risk at that time to help non-banking investors discover and familiarize with private debt in general, and with infrastructure debt in particular. So the objective of the chair was to develop research and tools to bridge the information and model gap between public and private markets. The first focus of the chair was on the definition, the nature, and the risk-adjusted performance measurements of private infrastructure debt, with a focus on project finance debt. Since then, Frédéric and the team have produced several important research outputs and tools for the understanding of the infrastructure debt asset class. Notably, Frédéric successfully created an unlisted infrastructure indexing platform with a credit risk approach for infrastructure project finance. So in 2019, discussing with Frédéric, we decided to bring the understanding of the infrastructure asset class to the next level on the debt side, and to renew our partnership with a new 3-year research chair directed by the same team, and with the objective to create usable, comparable documented measures of the impact and risk profile of ESG factors on infrastructure investments. We thought that this would be very useful for the infrastructure market to get all of these elements, with 3 key objectives of the chair. The first one is to produce a comprehensive but synthetic analysis of existing ESG report standards, framework and tools. And this will be presented today by Frédéric. The second objective is to create global metrics of ESG impacts and risks. For example, we would like to be able to measure the social acceptability of infrastructure assets, the economic impact of such assets, or the climate risk exposure of various projects. The third objective of the chair is to use this newly created taxonomy of ESG impacts to gather all the necessary data in real time in order to produce indices that can be used, for instance, by investors to define their investment strategy. Here again, the objective is to bring more liquidity for infrastructure financing, and also to bridge the gap between the public and private markets. ESG refers to the main factors in measuring the sustainability and ethical impact of investment in a company or in a business. As we all know, it's now a widely discussed topic. It's a key topic as well for the EU, given the new SFRD, Sustainable Finance Reporting Directive for 2022 and 2023. Yet, despite the topic's relevance in the financial world, few measures exist to help investors to track ESG outcomes and related risks. At Natixis, we put ESG at the heart of our ambition and we also include and consider its risk dimension. As an example, for instance, we created the green weighting factor. This is a unique and innovative tool whereby we link the capital allocation of each financing we are putting in place to its environmental impact and to its climate transition risk. So this is now for us a key strategic decision-making tool. More than that, we want to contribute to the academic research and development on this topic. And this is why we are working closer together with EDHEC Infra team to support our clients worldwide through their energy transition and sustainable development with innovative methods, products, and solutions. Our long-term relationship with EDHEC Infra and this second research chair is comforting our strategic ambition to innovate on sustainable financing. So we'll now leave the floor to Frédéric and the team, and I hope you will enjoy the topics that will be discussed today. Thank you. Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Christine, for this this introduction. And thank you, Natixis, for supporting this work. This is very important. And I'll come back towards the end of the presentation on the role of partners and exactly how we're setting up our research program on ESG. But let us get right into the heart of the matter. And as Anne-Christine said, the first objective today is to review the findings of a new paper. So let me just go there you go. What I wanted to do before we get right into the paper is to take a bit of a step back and kind of highlight our approach and also the philosophy with which we're looking at ESG. Our objective with this work, because we're asset pricing people, is to understand the role of ESG and infrastructure within the portfolio. Now, what do I mean by that? For a lot of investors, as you know well, ESG is an end in itself. It's an important topic. It's a perfectly legitimate type of investment objective, you might say. And in this case, the focus of investors tends to be purely on impacts. Okay, so whether or not by their investments they have certain types of impacts, positive or negative impacts. Obviously, we try to maximize the positive impacts and minimize the negative ones. But once we've said that, and this is very important, and we don't want to minimize this in any way. But once we've said that, there's still another type of question to address, which is how ESG interact with the rest of the portfolio, with the assets in the portfolio. And that is to say, how it is related with the value of assets, effectively. So how we approach this question is to restrict the field, so to speak, to one question, a financial question, which is how can we approach ESG in relation to asset value? Which, if you boil it down, really is asking the question, how does ESG relate to or create or minimizes certain risks that have an impact on asset value or asset values? Now, again, I realize this isn't the only question when it comes to ESG, and the objective to have an impact for the sake of having an impact is perfectly legitimate. But this question, the relation between ESG and asset value, is an important one. It's an important one for investment management. It's an important one from a fiduciary point of view. And as we will also briefly touched on today, it's an important one from a prudential perspective, because this is increasingly coming into the scope of the regulator. So maybe I could try and present the same idea a bit differently. If we ask ourselves why investors, and in this case, investors in infrastructure, have a specific and increasing demand in ESG reporting, which is the case, right? We see this in all the surveys, including the ones that EDHEC has done. Increasingly, investors are interested in ESG and want more ESG information. There are three reasons why that might be the case. One, it could be because ESG has an impact on asset values today in a completely direct and well understood way. So for instance, a company that pollutes, let's say a waste company, waste treatment company, or a water company that rejects water, is subjected to a number of environmental guidelines and regulations. And to the extent that it respects them or not, this ESG, environmental aspect of its operations, have a direct impact on asset value because we know the relationship between the two. So that's not a great secret. The second reason is that ESG could have an impact on asset values not too far into the distant future. So, and this is probably one of the main drivers of the interest in ESG from an asset valuation perspective, which is that it's possible, and here we can obviously think of climate change, that new regulations that come into place in the next few years or next couple of decades will have an impact on asset value. For example, a carbon tax. So because this is possible, this is something that enters into the scope of asset valuation, and it makes future cash flows more uncertain, and therefore it would have an impact on discount rates, for example. And then there's a third reason why investors have an interest in ESG, which is purely for the sake of ESG, as we were saying, because it captures non-financial objectives. By this, I mean objectives that have nothing to do with returns and risk. And in fact, irrespective of the impact on return or asset values in the portfolio, investors will decide to abide by certain ESG constraints or ESG objectives. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive things. They're in fact completely compatible. You could have make an investment decisions and take into account all three of these aspects. Now, as I was saying earlier, the third motive is usually focused on having an impact. From an investment standpoint, what it really amounts to is adding investment constraints to the portfolio. So you could say, for instance, I don't want to invest in core. That's a constraint. So you kind of remove certain assets or certain activities from the universe of what's possible in your portfolio. But again, the other two motives are also important because once we've established what these constraints are, so for instance, no core, we still need to manage the portfolio. We still need to understand and to report risk. And to the extent that ESG has something to do with that, and we see that it's still the case, it remains something that's worthwhile exploring from that perspective. So this is important because in the work that we've done, and that Nishta will present in a few minutes, we found very little emphasis on risk. We found a lot of emphasis on impact, but a very limited focus on risk. And this is partly a question of semantics. In fact, this is all a question of semantics and what sort of language you create to try and answer what kind of question. Often when we talk of impacts or risks, it's not completely clear in some of these frameworks whose impacts we're talking about and whose risks. For instance, if you pollute as a company, it's an impact, but obviously it's a risk for others, right? We're all exposed to the risks of climate change, for example. So what we're going to try and do by focusing specifically on infrastructure companies, so focusing on investment, is really trying to boil down this question to putting the company at the center of the analysis, the impact of companies and the risk that companies are exposed to. And from the moment that you define things in these terms, things become a little bit clearer. And also you start to be able to map the fact that some impacts creates or increase or reduce certain risks. And so you begin to be able to put together a mapping not only of risk and impacts, but also of how they function together, effectively a model of impacts and risks. So if I take a brief example just to just to try and highlight these ideas, if you have an infrastructure company, so let's say it's a bona fide infrastructure company, qualifies under the taxonomy, etc., and you can have equity or debt investments in that infrastructure company, it will have by its activity some non-ESG impacts, right? This is also something that's important to highlight because the the impacts of a company, including an infrastructure company, do not have to be ESG impacts. So it's difficult sometimes to, it's possible to get mixed up between what are straightforward economic impacts, basically consumption. So if you produce electricity and your customers consume electricity, that's an impact, but it's not an ESG impact. It's just consumption. And this is already reflected in asset values and in financial flows. But then you can also have other impacts, ESG impacts, beyond these strictly speaking economic impacts. For instance, on the environment, on people, or on your own organization. So this is our ESG world. Now, of course, these impacts of the activity of the firm themselves can be bad. So you can have, you could create climate change. You can make people upset. You could have governance problems, etc. Or they could be good. You could be investing in mitigation technology. You could be making your employees very happy, etc. But some of these ESG impacts will then create ESG or non-ESG risk exposure. So this is obviously a simplified view of the world. But once you start to put things in those terms, you begin to be able to put things in a way that's going to help you to answer our question, which is, what is the relationship between ESG and asset value? Okay, so we're going to try and see if we can do this. But just as a final point, before we move on to the paper, this focus, which may seem a bit restricted, a bit narrow, you might think, oh, okay, this question of asset pricing is not very nice, but ESG is about so much more. It's something that is very relevant from a regulation point of view. So Natixis pointed out the development of new regulation and new reporting requirements, SFDR in particular. And if you look at SFDR, in fact, this is completely aligned. They're interested in trying to understand risks and impacts. And they mentioned very specifically something they call sustainability risk, which is defined in SFDR as an environmental, social, or governance event or conditions that, if it occurs, could cause an actual or potential material negative impact on the value of the investment. And that's because the role of prudential regulators, and so this is emanating from prudential regulators, is to make sure that all investors are not exposed to systemic sources of risk, or not too much anyway, to avoid obviously systemic developments, systemic large losses of value basically at one point in time throughout the financial system. So we see that taking this approach has implications beyond the question of managing portfolios, and it's actually something that is very important. So our question, again, how can we approach ESG in relation to asset values? What we try to do in this paper, in part, is to ask the question, can we try and find some ideas, or can we actually answer this question using existing ESG reporting schemes for infrastructure? Okay, so we've done a review, and we've done a sort of analysis of all these schemes. So I will let Nishta now take over this presentation and show you the first results of, no, actually not the first results, all the results of this research.
Thank you, Frederick, and hello to everyone listening. Thank you for joining us today. As Frederick mentioned, in just shortly before, is that our research is focused on one question, which is, how should we approach the relationship between ESG and the market value of infrastructure investments? And this question essentially bound everything that we did in relation to ESG, in relation to the ESG schemes that are used, and in relation to the further research that we will be conducting. Now, our approach to begin answering this question is fourfold. That is, we first begin by reviewing the ESG schemes currently used for the infrastructure sector. We look at these schemes to understand how similar or different they are. Do they converge? Do they diverge? And also, do they approach the concepts of asset pricing? In order to make this comparison between these schemes, we required a way to compare them against one another, which is why we need step 2, which is mapping these schemes against one another on a common interface, or so-called meta standard, which is essentially the taxonomy that Anne-Christian and Frederick touched upon before. So this is a taxonomy of ESG impacts and risks for infrastructure companies, which is used to map all the disclosures of the different ESG schemes together. I will return to this point shortly and explain this a little bit more in detail. After we map all of these schemes together, what we would then like to do is compare these schemes and understand what they are like. That is, what ESG topics do they cover? How do they measure ESG data? What sort of data do they use, etc. And finally, we use all of this understanding derived from this exercise to answer a research question and also to predict how these schemes will evolve in the near future. Now, this approach that we take is derived from precedent academic literature. And in particular, we rely on a study by Berg and colleagues who took a similar approach to study ESG ratings for listed equities. That is, they did what I essentially explained, wherein they mapped the schemes together based on a taxonomy they developed, and then found out that these schemes diverged a lot in terms of scope. That is, they picked up different things when describing ESG in terms of measurement. That is, they looked at different type of ESG data. In terms of weights, they gave a different importance to the ESG topics that they looked at. And finally, aggregation, wherein they combined these different topics in different ways to give final scores. And in addition to finding out that these schemes diverge a lot and are inherently quite different, they found that they're also highly redundant. Now, following this approach, what we did was we reviewed 12 ESG tools and standards, which I will collectively refer to as schemes in this presentation, by first building a taxonomy of ESG disclosures, that is creating a meta standard, and then mapping these schemes to this taxonomy, and finally assessing their divergence in terms of the scope, measurement, weight, and aggregation as followed by Berg. Now, before we start to compare and assess these different ESG schemes, we took one step back to try to understand our data, which is essentially these ESG schemes. We wanted to know what they are like, and to begin with, we wanted to know what they are like, why are there so many of them, and what will happen to this eventually. And we found a lot of academic literature on voluntary accountability standards, such as these ESG schemes, which said that the schemes such as this, which are voluntary accountability schemes, eventually evolve following a specific path to consolidation. Which is that at the outset, there are different schemes that are developed to meet stakeholder demand, which is in this case, infusing accountability with regard to environmental and social topics and users. However, since many of these schemes are developed independently from each other, it often leads to duplication of efforts, perhaps even undermines the stringency of a few of these schemes. And given that there's so many out there, it causes confusion on part of investors. It causes skepticism and poses questions regarding their credibility and legitimacy, because of which eventually all of these schemes consolidate, they mature, and they move towards a combination or a subset of these schemes. And usually this is initiated by a salient organization. And finally, what happens on this path of consolidation is that these schemes are brought into regulations, like we just discussed the SFDRs, and when this happens, this becomes a prerequisite. Companies have to comply, as well as it becomes necessary to comply to these schemes to maintain certain business relationships. Now, it's at this phase that this path of consolidation is complete, and usually this process takes a few decades. In the case of ESG schemes for infrastructure, these schemes only started appearing after 2006 and have proliferated since 2015. So it's safe to say that these schemes are fairly young, and this process is ongoing. When I refer to these schemes in the next set of slides, I refer to the schemes on your right, which are the schemes that we reviewed. Yeah. In order to understand where in the consolidation process these schemes are, and to answer a research question, which is to see how these schemes impact the market value of these investments, we have to look at these schemes and compare them against one another, as I mentioned some time ago. In order to do this, what we need is a taxonomy. The taxonomy in this case, once again, refers to a taxonomy of ESG impacts and risks, which is built for infrastructure companies. We have to take one step back and mention that infrastructure herein is defined using TICS, which is the classification standard of infrastructure companies used by investors to map their portfolio, and includes physical asset level subclasses of industrial activities. And finally, when describing the boundaries of ESG, we actually relied on the different schemes that we reviewed. That is, we didn't reinvent ESG. Rather, we looked at the standards and picked out those aspects of the standards, those are relevant for our research question. That is to answer the question of relationship between ESG and the market value of ESG investments. Thus, to put it all together, the taxonomy was built for infrastructure companies as the unit of account, since that's what we're interested in, and focuses on impacts and risks to these companies, more so on risks than impacts, because again, this is what we want to find out in relationship to companies and their market value of investments. In building the taxonomy, we go beyond the redundancy of data and make this parsimonious. That is, when we define this taxonomy and we define all the impacts and risks, it is applicable universally to any infrastructure company, of course, in different degrees. Now, as mentioned before, we built the taxonomy based on the standards. Now, the standards go in all directions and are built for different purposes, but we have one question. So we look at these standards and schemes to the extent that they help us answer these questions. So in order to build the taxonomy, what we did was we looked at all the disclosures that the schemes use and categorized or grouped them together to define the boundaries or to pick up essentially the important ESG topics. And in this process, some of these topics or disclosures were left out of the ESG taxonomy since they were not relevant for us. It's not that they're not relevant for these schemes or these are not relevant questions to answer. These were just not relevant topics that helped us approach our research question. For example, financial risks, which may very well result from ESG impacts, but strictly speaking are not ESG in themselves. Hence, this was not an element of the ESG taxonomy, which is financial risks. In doing this, we couldn't categorize about 18% of all the disclosures that we had, and we had quite a number of them, which was 4,850. In addition to this, we grounded the taxonomy in well-established theoretical and empirical notions in order to make this comparable and strong, wherein, for example, physical risk classes rely on existing taxonomies of natural disasters. Economic impact classes are built using human development indicators of the United Nations, etc. The structure of the taxonomy is as follows. We have 3 pillars, which is environmental, social, and governance, and 2 dimensions, the dimension of impact and the dimension of risk. The taxonomy in itself is built using classification theory and has 3 levels, which is the levels of superclasses, classes, and subclasses. An example of the superclasses are available on the screen, but I will discuss this again on the next slide. What is worthwhile to note here that these classes and superclasses of impacts and risks defined are independent of each other. That is, they are different types of impacts and different types of risks faced by infrastructure companies. Even though, for example, in the environmental risk section, it consists of a superclass of physical risk, which can then have the classes of geophysical events, hydrological events, climatological events, and meteorological events. Breaking this down further into subclasses, the geophysical events can be of 3 types, which is earthquake, volcanoes, or movement of the earth. In defining risks like this, it helps us categorize what the actual independent risks to the infrastructure company from the environment are. And this classification of physical risk, for example, is based on a taxonomy of natural disasters by the Center of Research on Epidemiology of Disasters. Again, it's based on well-established notions. Even though we've separated impacts and risks in our taxonomy in order to enable a clear understanding and a clear measurement of these impacts and risks, based on the type they are, there are still feedback mechanisms that exist between them. And to understand these mechanisms, we build a relationship matrix between these impacts and risks. That is, we try to find out which impacts drive other impacts or risks and which risks drive other impacts or risks. And what we found is that ESG risks are often driven by ESG impacts. A hypothesis that we made earlier on in this presentation and an explanation that Frederick gave some time ago. Now, once we start to understand all of these different impacts and risks, what we see that this starts to emerge looking more like a dynamic model of how ESG impacts and risks work together, which is more likely a clear representation of the world, because impacts cause risks and hence causes a change in market valuation. So now that we have this taxonomy, which is available in detail in the paper, what we now have to do is map the reviewed schemes against the taxonomy. In conducting the mapping exercise, which included 4,850 disclosures mapped to different subclasses of the taxonomy, we could only map 7 out of the 12 schemes that we reviewed. Because in order to do the mapping, we needed exact disclosures that the schemes used. And some of these schemes do not provide the exact disclosures that they use in the public domain. So we couldn't map those to our taxonomy. And another thing to note is that the schemes usually combine multiple types of disclosure information in one indicator type. That is, any given indicator can be reported using different types of information contingent on what sector, contingent on the sector of the company, and also what information the company can provide, or just alternate questions available to users to try to answer the same question. But what we do is we account for all possible types of information that can be used to capture specific impacts and risks. And hence the 1,600 plus disclosures of the schemes expand to this number of 4,850 disclosures, which we mapped. On the right in pink, you see the schemes that we could actually map to the taxonomy. Now, on completing this mapping, what we found was significant divergence. First, there was a significant scope divergence, which is that the schemes use different definitions of infrastructure and covered ESG in various aspects. Second is measurement divergence, that is, ESG issues were mainly measured qualitatively as a function of company activities and not that of actual impacts or risks. 3, schemes have weight divergence, which is schemes have a different view on how important ESG topics are based on mainly user-driven materiality assessments. And finally, an aggregation divergence, which says that ESG schemes combine scores in different ways, making output of different schemes incomparable. Let's look into detailed results below. So the first aspect that we looked at was scope divergence. Now, scope divergence comes from schemes having different aims, different types of developers, different intended end users, and different definitions of infrastructure and ESG. Now, this is expected because the individual schemes are developed to do different things, and hence they use appropriate definitions that help fit their purpose, which doesn't always overlap. So even if the schemes are different, it doesn't mean one is better than the other. All it means is that they intend to do different things in different ways. Now, the first important question that we asked to understand scope divergence was that what definitions of infrastructure do different schemes use? Now, in terms of this, what we saw that standard setters like GRESB and increasingly large number of investors actually use the infrastructure company classification standard, or TICS. Some use in-house schemes, standalone definitions of infrastructure, which with different degrees of overlap with TICS, and Other multi-sector schemes use industry filters such as GICS, which do not isolate infrastructure companies from equipment suppliers and other types of firms active in this industry. So what this leads to is that different schemes approach infrastructure sectors in varying granularities, causing scope divergence. The second question that we asked to understand scope divergence was that what aspects of ESG are covered by these different schemes. Now, this figure on the right shows that the coverage of ESG, environmental, social, and governance pillars, is unequal and completely different within the schemes. Some schemes are more focused on governance disclosures, while some schemes are more focused on environmental ones. And the underlying reason here is actually the lack of consensual definitions of ESG used. Now, when we say that they are more focused on environment or more focused on governance, it doesn't mean that they are essentially schemes to understand environmental issues or governance issues. It simply means that maybe they have, given that ESG is not a well-defined subject in itself, maybe they just cover more environmental topics than the other scheme, or maybe they have a more number of disclosures trying to capture the same topic. So more for environmental or more for governance as opposed to the others. Now, as an example, let's look at the social pillar. We see from the figure that not all social impact and risk topics identified in the ESG taxonomy are covered equally by the schemes. That is, no scheme covers all social topics. That is, for us, no scheme covers all topics that are relevant to understand the relationship between social performance of companies and its market value, as defined by our ESG taxonomy. Of course, there are some classes of impacts and risks that are better covered than the others. Some have a partial coverage, and that's what it is right now. Taking one step further, we looking at this at the subclass level. That is, the class of general public has the subclasses of sector reputation, privatization perception, and company reputation. And we see how the different schemes cover these three subclasses of the class of general social acceptability from general public. And what we find striking is that none of these schemes actually cover sector reputation. That is, none of these schemes capture what people think about a sector as a whole. So for example, the schemes don't capture what people think about coal power plants. And this information is relevant in the context of our research question, as this could manifest in political risk for the complete sector, causing an impact on the market value of companies within the sector. Finally, what we find when we try to understand that do these schemes cover impacts or risks, we find that most of these schemes, one is that they cover different aspects of ESG in terms of environmental, social, and governance. And two is that they focus more on impacts and less on risks. Taking all of these disclosures together, the 4850 disclosures together, we find that 88% of all of these disclosures are actually impact type, and only 12% are risk type. Now, of course, there's always this question of risk management. And almost all of the schemes look at risk management. But if you think about what risk management inherently is, it's a corporate activity of the company that, while has a positive governance impact, doesn't necessarily reveal the risk exposure of companies. So when we say schemes capture little risk and more impacts, the risk management activity is actually a function of impacts and not risks. Second, we come to measurement divergence, which is asking the question of, do the schemes measure the same thing? If they don't, or if they do, what kind of data do they use to measure these different ESG aspects? And what we find is that ESG schemes have two ways to collect data. One is user-reported data, wherein the schemes ask the users questions and the users respond. And the schemes then give you a rating or a score based on your response. And two is derived or calculated data, which is the schemes don't look for user-reported data, but look for third-party sources or information available in the public domain to capture information about ESG. And of course, since companies, since reported data is going to be of a lot more different type and a lot more granular and than data available in the public domain, essentially using user-reported data or derived data looks at reporting of very different ESG metrics. Second, when we actually look at what type of data this is, what we find is that there are 5 kinds of indicators that can be used to measure ESG performance or to report ESG performance, which is input indicators, which is referring to information about the resources used by the company, process and output indicators, referring to the activities of the company, and short-term and long-term effect indicators, which are actual indicators of impact, which actually tell you what the impact or what the risk was. And what we find is that most of these schemes use process and output kind of information. That is, they use information about the company activities, which results in a proxy of ESG impact or risk, but it's not the actual measure of impact or risk. And given that actual measures of ESG risks and impacts are difficult to derive, this was expected. Finally, when we look at the type of data used to assess ESG, we find that schemes use a combination of qualitative and quantitative data to report ESG performance, but this data is overwhelmingly qualitative. We then come to understanding the question of weight divergence. Weight divergence is the difference in views on the relative importance of different issues, which is which issue is more material and which issue is less important. Now, the question that we need to answer in order to understand the weight divergence is that how do different schemes approach materiality assessments? So a materiality assessment is nothing but a basis of determining what to report and how much weight should be assigned to each aspect when calculating the final scores. Now, given that different users require different type of information to make different types of ESG assessments, and schemes often cater to multiple user types and multiple sectors, the materiality assessments in the current context are mainly user-driven. Of course, it is subject to guidelines, verifications, or support from professionals, but it is still mainly user-driven. So what this suggests is that the users have a large role to play in defining the weight of the different ESG topics in developing the final score. And when you look at what weight divergence, what the implications of this are, is that you understand that the schemes at the moment are currently built as a list of types of information. That is, they give you a few different issues and you can choose and pick which issue is relevant to you, which is not. Of course, there are some issues which always have to be reported and which are always relevant, but others can be optional. So these schemes at the moment are developed as a dictionary of all possible issues, but it's not based on a system of knowledge. It's not based on a robust framework. And we come back to the question of addressing materiality in some time. The final question that we wanted to answer was that of aggregation divergence, which is how do different schemes produce the final performance measures? What methodology do they apply and what is the actual final output? So in making this assessment, we asked the question of, okay, so let's see what the final output of these schemes are. And we found out that schemes either produce scores, ratings, certifications, reports, benchmarks, and this list is a little long. And these outputs are not directly comparable. For example, it's not straightforward to compare scores out of 100 and certification levels such as bronze, silver, and platinum. I mean, you can expect that higher the score and higher the certification level means that this company is good. But sometimes that's also not the case because since schemes diverge in scope, that is, they measure or look at different aspects of ESG, a high score in one doesn't necessarily translate to a high score used by the other scheme. And what is another point that we found is that the outputs are not directly additive. That is, your performance in the environmental sphere cannot be offset by your performance in the social sphere and vice versa, etc. But yet, a lot of times, most of these schemes combine the scores into a single compound score. Of course, there are also detailed scores available, but then again, a combined score is provided to make comparisons between companies, which could be misleading. And given that these scores could be misleading, and given that a lot of schemes use different types of outputs, it's difficult for users, for investors and regulators to compare performance between companies that measure their performance using different schemes, which also brings us to the likely conclusion that there will be some consolidation between these schemes. It will be necessary to enable meaningful comparison. To conclude the review and the mapping exercise carried out in the paper, we find that the findings are in line with those of the literature on ESG about other asset classes like equities. 2, ESG schemes for infrastructure investors tend to diverge in terms of scope, measurement, weight, and aggregation, and they diverge significantly. And 3, there is a silver lining, that is that these schemes can be mapped together using a parsimonious set of impact and risk classes that reveals their strength, which is impact measurement, and also weaknesses like risk measurement. I will now pass the floor back to Frederick to talk more about where these schemes are expected to go and the next steps in our ESG research.
Thank you, Nishta. I see we already have a few questions. So yes, having done all of that and all of this review and analysis, which taught us a lot about how we wanted to approach the problem ourselves, we've determined where to go. So we've made a roadmap. As I'll try to argue, we've already made a few steps down this roadmap, but we're not quite there yet. First, what's going to happen to these ESG schemes? I think we can safely say that we're still at the proliferation stage. But as Nishta pointed out, this might move very fast compared to other sustainability standards or disclosure standards. This isn't accounting, which took practically a century to consolidate or more, nor is this fair trade or standards that took a long time to become kind of aggregated at the global level. Here we have a very strong push, as everybody knows, from the regulator, from policymakers, but also from investors to move forward, especially on the subject of climate change, but also other aspects of ESG. So we can safely conclude that these schemes, while they diverge a lot and they have these sort of built-in biases, will continue to change and to evolve. And perhaps this research can help them to evolve in the most effective way and in the best direction. What we need for this consolidation to take place and for rules to become increasingly integrated is a consensual infrastructure definition, which luckily we have because we have TICs, which some of the schemes already use, such as GRESB, and which a lot of investors also use. So this is one thing we can actually safely put aside and say we've defined. Then we need a taxonomy of ESG risks and impacts, which we've built with this paper. Of course, this is something that, like other such works, and I'll come back to this in a minute, but we intend to involve the industry in its governance and its evolution. And just like TICs, it will be something that will continue to evolve over time. And finally, we need an objective way to measure these impacts and these risks. We need something that is increasingly consensual and can be used. And in particular, for me, as someone who's trying to look at asset prices, I need factors that I can define well, that are independent from each other, that I can put against a bunch of rates of return to try and see if they can explain the returns, etc. In a nutshell, we need to address the question of materiality, which, as Nishta was also highlighting, is probably the weakest point in the current themes because it's all over the place and it's still very subjective. This needs to become completely objectified, basically. So the way ahead, if you take a bit of a higher view, a longer term view, is to create what I call ESG investment knowledge. So to answer this question of how to manage ESG within the portfolio. What does ESG mean for risk management, for asset management, for liability management? We need to go from the raw data to information, which is basically clean data, and one step further to investment knowledge. So today, the schemes that we've reviewed create a lot of data. We know that's the case. A lot of data is being reported. They create some information. We know there is a certain amount of redundancy across these indicators. As you saw, there are thousands of them, and actually many thousand disclosures related to thousands of indicators. And you can summarize this with a much more nimble, much more parsimonious framework. So there is probably some information, or rather some of the data that's being produced that's not needed. But anyway, some information is being created through these schemes, but what remains very scarce today is investment knowledge. These schemes are not designed to answer asset pricing questions, so I can't run my asset pricing model against these characteristics. Especially because they're super correlated with each other most of the time. And anyway, as I was trying to highlight at the beginning, the point of these schemes is to focus on the third motive to have an interest in ESG, what I call the third motive, which is ESG for the sake of ESG, which is to maximize impact, to make sure that from a point of view of, let's say, the societal mission and role of investment players, of investment companies, a number of criteria are taken into account, but not so much to develop an investment knowledge. Okay, what we need is effectively an explicit model of the financial materiality of ESGs, and this is probably also why materiality has remained a sort of fuzzy thing, because if most of the attraction of ESG reporting until now has been on the third motive, right, the impact side of things, pure impact, then materiality, which is fundamentally a financial concept, is less relevant. What matters is principles. You don't want to do certain things, you insist on doing other things, and not so much the question of how material it is, right? So in order to answer this question, which again becomes increasingly important as the regulator kind of absorbs the question of materiality, of ESG, I mean, you have to address the question of materiality. So what do I mean by investment knowledge? This is actually something that probably sounds a bit highbrow, called an ontology. Some of you might remember this term from the philosophy class. It's actually a term that also lives in the world of information science and machine learning these days. And what that means is to create effectively a domain, to define a domain of knowledge. So to define clearly what it is that we're trying to track, and then to determine a set of classifications, for example, classifying infrastructure companies, classifying ESG impacts and risks, but also classifying all sorts of other things that are relevant to slotting all this information essentially into a database, and also to build these relationships between these different classes. And here you're talking about effectively building models of the interaction between different aspects, right? So what impacts create risk, what risks create other risks, etc. And how are these risks and these impacts related to asset value? The point, of course, is to create something that has some kind of predictive power that we can then use for reporting on risk, on value, on returns, etc. So this, if you think about it, so we've fairly well established what is the area of knowledge that we were interested in, what is the domain of knowledge that we're interested in. And then the rest of this stuff, which sounds very technical and a bit boring, building taxonomies, relationships, etc. This is how we're going to answer the materiality question. Because once we have all these aspects, once we know what's what and what matters for each type of asset, then we can try and document what risks and what impacts are material for different types of infrastructure companies. So with this paper, we've made some headway in developing this system of knowledge, right? We've defined it, we've described it, we describe how it works in the paper. And now we need to design the ESG impacts and risks materiality profiles. So what that means is we're going to do this the same way we developed TICS in 2018. If you think about it, TICS is also it's a taxonomy for sure, and it's also a system of knowledge, right? It tells you how to think about what infrastructure companies are like. And this was done using the idea that because we wanted things to be well defined, we made sure that every criteria was observable and could be objectively determined. For example, in TICS, companies either have a contractor business model or a regulated business model or a merchant business model, and you have some subclasses, but basically you can't escape this. You have to pick one, right? And we can all agree also, if we look at one asset, which one is which and which one applies to which company. So likewise, for materiality, we need something like that, something that's based on science, that's based on the physics of these assets, on the economics of these assets, and on the financial economics of these assets. Something that we can then all agree when we look at asset A, it's like this, it's like that, this is what it does, and this is what matters. And obviously, this will differ between different types of assets. So in our taxonomy of infrastructure companies in TICS, we have different assets. We have LNG regasification terminals or gas-fired power plants, etc. And for each one of these, we want to define a materiality profile, both in terms of risk and in terms of impacts, ESG risk and ESG impacts, that is specific to this. And we will do this, we've started doing this, but we will do this in consultation with the industry because, again, the objective here is to be very consensual and to have something like TICS, which people can use. This is an example of that. If you were to build, this is actually an incomplete example, it's just a few boxes, but if you were to build a physical risk materiality profile for airports, and you wanted to look specifically, for example, at flood risk, you would say, okay, well, what's an airport? How is it built? What sort of flood risk exists? What might be the drivers or the predictors of this flood risk? So, for example, in this case, you would look at the elevation data. You would look at the distance from the sea. If you're worried about sea level rise, you would look at different geographic or topographic elements if you were worried about rainfall, excessive rainfall, etc., etc. So by going really deep into the details like this for each type of asset, we can define what are the drivers of each one of those classes of risk and impacts that we have in this taxonomy and try to document them. Okay, and this is where it gets really exciting because we have now we're at the stage where we're going to go from ontology, which again sounds a bit boring, to big data, which is super exciting because we like computers and it's fashionable. But no, more seriously, there is a lot of data that exists about these things. It's sitting around in text, maps, satellite pictures, etc. There's lots and lots and lots of it. In fact, there's a number of proof of concepts already of how you might use this data to measure some of these risks and impact, but there is no industrial solution today to do this. Thanks to new development in computer science, we can now collect, aggregate, manipulate this data. In fact, we are building something, I'm really excited about this. We're building something I didn't even know existed last year. It's called a data lake, which is a machine learning concept by which we will aggregate all our data into one great big system, which can then be exploited as a whole, as a data lake. I'll come back to the work of the machine learning team in a minute. But basically, once we can now aggregate all this information and we can exploit it because algorithms can be created to answer the questions that we have in terms of, because now we've defined the question, we've defined this system of knowledge, we've defined these categories, so we know what we want to get from the data, which is the key. So let me develop this a little bit in terms of what we're going to do in the future for the next few years. And Christine highlighted at the beginning of the seminar that we've been working with Natixis for a while now, since 2012. Natixis was with us when we developed our infrastructure debt indices, which are now also industrialized. And now we're working together on ESG. We also have a new partner, and one that is very much a complementary partner to this project, because we've been working with the Monetary Authority of Singapore on the same thing, on developing financial indices and benchmarks since 2015. And very recently, in fact, this is made public today for the first time, MS has decided to support the development of our infrastructure climate risk data and analytics for the next 5 years as well. So we have extensive and long-term support from the industry to work on this with very strong partners who have been working with us for a long time. This industry support plus the investment that EDHEC is putting into this research, it's $10 million for the next 5 years. It's fully funded. So it's going to happen. And we've now put in place a dedicated team to develop this fundamental research and to transform it into actual usable products. So we have, of course, our team of infrastructure investment specialists, but we now also have a team of data science and machine learning experts who are building data lakes, amongst other things, and extracting information from all this data. And of course, we also have a production team which can transform all this work into actual usable data for the industry. So this research program will very much look like what we did for TICS again. So we're basically building, as well as standardization processes, something that eventually will converge with, well, first will be developed in partnership with the industry, but also will converge towards our financial indices. So in the end, it should hopefully become one thing, including being able to answer these questions of the relationship between financial performance, which we've now been producing information about for almost a year and a half, and ESG data. So on the to-do list, and I think that's the end, for the next 5 years, I have to complete the technical framework to create ESG investment knowledge. This is the stuff we were talking about just now, about building these materiality profiles. I have doing this in alignment with the requirement to document these impacts under SFDR. The reason is that, and this is something as, and again, Nishta was talking about, the regulation catches up with this very quickly now. And as a result, this will become one of the drivers of this work, because it has to be effectively. There's one of the questions on I've seen from Gianluca, I think, from about what should you adopt standards now? Should you wait? Well, actually, what matters is what the regulator is going to decide, at least to a large extent, and especially when it comes to the financial perspective on ESG. We will extend the governance of TICS today to this new knowledge. So we'll basically integrate the management of this new ESG taxonomy into the TICS review committee, which already includes a whole lot of key players in the market, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, and work on this creation of objective and science-based ESG materiality profiles, because this is what will give us the final block, if you want, to do the data collection and finally to build the metrics that we're interested in. Essentially, we'll be building metrics about exposure. So the exposure of different infrastructure companies, individual infrastructure companies, to different types of risks and their contribution to different types of impacts on a relative basis.